Imagine a world much like ours, bustling cities, busy trade, and people full of hope. The streets are alive with the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, children playing, and travelers from distant lands sharing stories and goods. Life in medieval Europe, though often harsh, is filled with a sense of possibility and connection, as people gather in marketplaces and ports, building communities and forging new paths. But in 1347, a shadow fell, one that would change the course of history forever. The Black Death began its relentless march, creeping silently into the heart of Europe beneath ominous stormy skies. It struck rich and poor alike, sparing no one. Kings and beggars, merchants and laborers, all were equally vulnerable to the invisible enemy that now stalked the land. The story starts in Kaffa, a Crimean port under Mongol siege. This bustling trade hub, once a symbol of prosperity, became the unlikely ground zero for a catastrophe. As Mongol soldiers died from a mysterious illness, their bodies were catapulted over the city walls, an early act of biological warfare. The defenders inside watched in horror as the disease crept closer, carried by the very air they breathed. The terrified Genoese merchants, desperate to escape the siege and the sickness, fled by sea, unknowingly carrying the seeds of disaster with them. Their ships, once symbols of hope and commerce, now became vessels of doom. Hidden in the dark corners of their ships were black rats and fleas, the true carriers of the disease. These tiny stowaways would prove more deadly than any army. These ships became floating coffins, drifting from port to port, spreading the plague to unsuspecting European harbors. Each arrival brought new waves of sickness and fear. When they finally arrived in Sicily and Messina, most sailors were already dead or dying, their bodies ravaged by the mysterious illness. The few survivors brought only terror and confusion. Authorities tried desperately to turn the ships away, but it was too late. The rats and fleas had already come ashore. The plague had landed, and with it a sense of dread that would soon engulf the continent. From these ports the disease spread rapidly along trade routes and riverways, consuming everything in its path. Merchants, travelers, and even the wind seemed to carry the infection further, reaching towns and villages hundreds of miles away in a matter of weeks. The world was about to change forever. Streets that once echoed with laughter and commerce now stood silent, haunted by the specter of death. No one could have predicted how quickly the terror would spread. Rumors and fear traveled faster than the disease itself, sowing panic in every corner of Europe. The Black Death was unstoppable, and Europe was utterly unprepared. Physicians and healers, powerless against the plague, could only watch as entire communities fell. The stage was set for one of history's darkest chapters. Chroniclers and priests recorded the devastation, their words echoing through the centuries as a warning and a lament. The shadow had begun its journey, stretching across fields and cities, leaving devastation in its wake. The world would never be the same. In the aftermath, nothing, neither society nor faith, nor the very fabric of daily life, would remain untouched by the Black Death. The Black Death's origins can be traced back to the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, a region of rolling grasslands and ancient trade routes. Here, the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis quietly thrived for centuries, living among wild rodent populations such as marmots and gerbils, largely unnoticed by humans. Over time, dramatic climate shifts and environmental changes forced these rodents to migrate closer to human settlements, bringing their fleas, and the deadly bacteria they carried, into direct contact with people. The rise of the Mongol Empire and its vast interconnected trade networks, especially the legendary Silk Road, transformed these ancient routes into highways for commerce and for disease. By the 1330s, outbreaks of plague had already devastated entire regions of China, killing millions. But the rest of the world remained largely unaware of the looming threat. The plague moved relentlessly westward, hitching rides with caravans across deserts and aboard ships that sailed the vast seas, spreading silently from one community to the next. It swept through great cities like Baghdad and Alexandria, leaving devastation in its wake and sparing no one, regardless of wealth or status. When the plague finally reached the bustling port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1347, it marked only the beginning of Europe's nightmare. Europe's cities were crowded and filthy, with narrow alleys, poor sanitation, and little understanding of how diseases spread, making them perfect breeding grounds for the pestilence. People lived side by side with livestock, waste piled up in the streets, and superstition and fear shaped daily life, leaving the population dangerously exposed. The entire continent was ripe for a pandemic, its people unaware of the invisible threat that was about to descend upon them. The arrival of the plague was not a sudden shock, but rather the tragic result of years of vulnerability and neglect. It was in many ways an inevitability. Europe was completely unprepared for this invisible enemy. Doctors and officials were powerless, and confusion reigned in the streets. The stage was set for catastrophe as darkness gathered over the medieval world and the great pestilence prepared to strike. The Black Death struck in 3 terrifying forms, each more deadly and mysterious than the last, leaving medieval Europe in a state of panic and confusion. These were known as bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague, each with its own set of gruesome symptoms and rapid, often fatal progression. Bubonic plague was the most common form, causing excruciatingly painful blackened swellings called buboes, usually found in the groin, armpit, or neck. Victims suffered from high fever, chills, and overwhelming agony, often becoming delirious as the infection took hold. For many, death followed within a week, despite desperate attempts at treatment. The speed of decline left families and communities reeling. Pneumonic plague was even more frightening, attacking the lungs and spreading easily from person to person through coughing and sneezing. Victims struggled to breathe, coughed up blood, and could die within just a few days. Septicemic plague was the swiftest and most lethal form, racing through the bloodstream and killing its victims in mere hours, sometimes before any visible symptoms appeared, leaving little chance for survival. The sheer speed and horror of these deaths made the plague seem like a supernatural curse, fueling terror and superstition throughout the land. Yet, the true culprit was far more mundane. The flea, a tiny parasite carried by black rats that thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and cities. Rats infested every corner of daily life, homes, bustling markets, and the holds of merchant ships. When infected rats died, their fleas leapt to humans, injecting the deadly bacteria with a single bite. Every ship that docked, every cart that rolled into town, and every traveler who arrived could unknowingly bring the plague to a new community, turning commerce and travel into deadly risks. The disease spread with terrifying speed, outpacing any efforts to contain it. People fled in panic, but the infection always seemed one step ahead. Fear and suspicion spread just as quickly as the infection itself, tearing at the fabric of society and leaving communities isolated and desperate. Streets emptied, marketplaces fell silent, and entire villages were abandoned as people tried in vain to escape the invisible killer. The relentless cycle of rat, flea, and human turned Europe into a vast landscape of contagion as the plague swept from town to town, leaving devastation in its wake. The deadliest pandemic in history was underway, reshaping the world and haunting the memories of generations to come. Daily life collapsed into chaos and fear. Church bells tolled endlessly for the dead. Carts rolled through the streets. "Bring out your dead!" Families turned on each other, terrified of infection. The poor, trapped in cramped quarters, suffered most. Entire households vanished overnight. Neighbors locked their doors, compassion replaced by survival. The rich fled to the countryside, but the plague followed. No one was truly safe. Death was the great equalizer. Some turned to desperate piety, joining processions and self-flagellation. Others gave in to wild abandon, spending recklessly and ignoring rules. The social fabric unraveled. Fear ruled every decision. The future vanished. Only the terrifying present remained. The world became a waking nightmare. The Black Death changed how people lived and how they died. Medieval societies scrambled for answers: prayer, superstition, and early public health. Cities like Venice pioneered quarantine, forcing ships to wait offshore. It was one of the few effective measures, but often too late. Doctors relied on ancient theories, lancing buboes and prescribing bizarre remedies. Nothing worked. Religious fervor soared. Flagellants marched, hoping to appease God. Their processions only spread the disease further. Fear bred scapegoating. Minorities, especially Jews, were blamed and persecuted. Massacres swept across Europe, adding human cruelty to the toll. The fight against the plague was desperate and mostly futile. The real enemy was ignorance. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in just 4 years. Cities like Florence lost 2/3 of their people. Entire villages vanished. Society's infrastructure collapsed. There weren't enough living to bury the dead. Mass graves became common. Rituals were abandoned. The psychological trauma was immense, families destroyed, survivors haunted. Orphans and broken lineages became the norm. The emotional scars lasted generations. Economically, fields went unplowed, crops rotted and famine followed. Trade halted and the web of commerce unraveled. The world lost not just people but the hands that built and fed it. Recovery would take decades. The Black Death was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. Europe would never be the same. The shadow of death lingered long after the plague had passed. Out of devastation, a new world emerged. Labor shortages gave surviving workers power. Wages rose, serfdom weakened, peasants gained leverage, and the old feudal order began to crumble. Uprisings erupted, and a new middle class started to rise. The plague cleared the way for social mobility and economic change. The church's authority was shaken. Its failure to stop the plague led to doubt and disillusionment. Faith became more personal, fueling future religious reforms. Medicine began to shift. Old theories failed, and practical measures like quarantine gained ground. Hospitals evolved, focusing more on treatment. The Black Death forced Europe to rethink society, faith, and science. It was a brutal lesson, but it sparked transformation. The seeds of the modern world were sown in the ashes of the plague. Change, once unthinkable, became inevitable. The Black Death was only the first wave. Plague outbreaks recurred for centuries. Fear of its return shaped cities, public health, and culture. The dance macabre became a haunting artistic motif. Death comes for all. Literature and language absorbed the trauma. Even nursery rhymes echoed the plague's memory. The population collapse led to cheaper land and concentrated wealth. Inheritance laws changed, fueling the Renaissance. The death of the old world fertilized the birth of the new. The Black Death marked the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of modernity. Old structures fell, new opportunities rose. The world's map, economy, and mindset were forever altered. The plague didn't just kill people, it ended an era. Its legacy still shapes us today. Today, the Black Death feels distant, but its lessons are urgent. It reminds us of our vulnerability. Disease can topple civilizations. The pandemic revealed both courage and cruelty in human nature. Doctors and priests risked their lives. Others abandoned loved ones or turned to violence. These reactions echo in every crisis, even now. The Black Death showed how interconnected our world is, then by trade, now by travel and technology. Public health is a global issue. No nation is immune. Only cooperation and transparency can defend against pandemics. The story is one of resilience. Societies collapsed, but humanity rebuilt. We learned, adapted, and created a new world. Even in darkness, there is hope for renewal. The Black Death is not just a story of death, but of survival and change. Its lessons still guide us as we face the uncertainties of the future.